Today we will be working on Chapter 13, the second half of Unit 5, where we're going to examine access to water resources for populations around the world. A lot of the case studies that we'll look at will be case studies in the United States, but when we do our Making Connections Day later in the unit, we'll start talking a little bit more about some international examples of water resources and water access. You're welcome to read all of Chapter 13 if you want, but I've summarized a lot of the main points and main topics here in this lecture, and I've supplemented with some additional images or figures to talk about the processes and talk about the concepts in a little bit more detail. So, unsurprisingly, we have a water shortage. Water scarcity around the world is high in many of the areas that are associated with the subtropical high. If you think back to when we studied the distribution of climates across Earth's latitude, it shouldn't be surprising when we look at this map and see a lot of the areas of water shortages are areas where we have deserts. And areas where water stress is fairly limited are areas where we have enough rainfall throughout all of the seasons to be able to meet the needs of the water usage. And so our more tropical locations tend to have no water scarcity issues, but our deserted locations have a lot of water scarcity issues. So dry climate is one of the factors. Drought, which is a prolonged period in which precipitation is about 70% lower than average, or evaporation is really high, can lead to water scarcity. And with climate change, we're starting to see those droughts be more intense in different areas around the world. The other places that we see water stress, even if there's enough rainfall, are areas where population is high or there's a large need for water usage, whether it's for industry, irrigation, public drinking water access, etc. If we're using too much water too fast, we deplete the resources before the rainfall can come and restore the water that we need in where we're taking it from. And that includes both groundwater draw up as well as surface water. Hydrological poverty is occurring sort of all across the planet in different ways. Some locations have a large percentage of the world's water resources that are accessible to them, and some do not. And so we see there's, interestingly enough, population distribution being disproportionate to access to water resources. In areas of Europe and Africa, we have a higher population than we have access to water resources. Asia probably is the most clear example of this, and that's not surprising when you think of the Middle East. And in North America, we have plenty of water access, in South America as well. But the usage in those areas might be quite high. Water is maintained unsustainably by overexploitation. We also contaminate water and prevent its usability through pollution and contamination. And we don't factor in a lot of the natural capital costs into the cost of water. So it's an area where we really need to think about how we're making it available to others. There's plenty of water on our planet. We are a blue planet. But the fresh water that we can actually access is just a small fraction of Earth's total water budget. We know that the hydrologic cycle should make water available to us. It should be a renewable resource. But the way that we use it is unsustainable and not very renewable right now. Most of our water is saline. We are starting some practices where we can access that saline, um, remove it from the water, and make that fresh water newly available. So we'll talk about desalination projects today. Of the fresh water that we do have, a significant portion of it is held up within our ice caps, um, both polar and basically Arctic and Antarctic, as well as a fair amount of alpine glaciers. We have access to some groundwater. Not all groundwater aquifers are accessible, but some are. And then we have a very small percent of surface water that is available to us. The other 0.9% is within part of the hydrologic cycle, usually up in Earth's atmosphere as water vapor. Of the surface water, we divide that into lakes, swamps, and rivers. Obviously, lakes hold the most fresh water, and rivers, where we actually get a lot of our drinking water, hold the least, which is, I think, surprising to some students. And so we use different abilities, different resources like dams, to be able to increase this water availability to different communities around the world. Make sure you are familiar with the basic hydrologic cycle. This looks pretty simple, and you probably remember most of this. Water in our atmosphere precipitates out, runs off in surface water through rivers and streams and lakes and eventually the ocean, and then is returned to the atmosphere via evaporation from surface or evapotranspiration from plants. One thing that we're going to add to the hydrologic cycle that you probably didn't when you were in middle school is what we call an aquifer. And so when groundwater sort of leaves the surface and enters into the soil or bedrock material, it can be found in what we call an aquifer. And aquifers come in two types. Unconfined means we have direct infiltration of water, surface water resources into that aquifer, and so it's constantly being replenished from the surface. And we can easily drill down into that water and pump it back to the surface for use, in this case, in agriculture. But we also have confined aquifers, which means when we try to access them, there's some sort of unpermeable layer that makes them harder to access. Usually that layer is made up of clay. If you think back to our soils lab in the fall, we saw that clay doesn't allow water to percolate very easily. It's not very permeable. We can access a confined aquifer using a well, but it's going to experience less replenishment. And the water that's in that confined aquifer can be drawn and removed and may not be recharged. So that is a problem when it comes to depleting aquifers. Confined aquifers don't get a lot of recharge, and that's a huge issue. These terms you should be familiar with. Here's another image showing both unconfined and confined aquifers. But essentially all groundwater is surface water that has percolated into soil, gravel, and essentially bedrock. And some rock types, some soil types are more porous than others and can hold more water than others can. If you were to dig down into the soil, mostly where we dig is going to be the zone of aeration, which is filled with gas pockets. But if you go down far enough, you reach what we call the zone of saturation. And the line between the zone of aeration, where we have air pockets, and the zone of saturation, where we have essentially liquid water that is filling the space between our particles, is called the water table. And that water table can rise or fall depending on the amount of precipitation that's coming in. If you've ever been in a location that is experiencing flooding, what's happening is the water table has risen above the surface of the soil in that location. And so you end up with a flooding event. As long as the water table is remaining under that soil, you're not going to have a flooding event. And so it's important for water resource managers to know where the zone of aeration is, where the zone of saturation is, and where that water table is at all times, so that we can be aware of just how much water we're using, how much water is being replenished into these groundwater resources, so that our rate of draw doesn't overwhelm the rate of recharge. So this idea of recharge refers to the amount of precipitation that's coming and percolating into our aquifer. Here's our unconfined aquifer here. And so natural recharge comes from the surface. Lateral recharge may come from nearby lakes and rivers, and basically recharge the amount of water in that aquifer by having water move laterally. It's still going to be moving downhill. Gravity still has an effect even underground, but it can move more laterally or sort of less steeply when we're looking at these aquifers. We are extracting groundwater at an alarming rate. Groundwater overdrafts exist throughout the United States and really throughout the world, where our use of that groundwater is exceeding the amount of recharge that aquifer is getting. So groundwater is great. I've lived in locations where we have well water access. The water is usually safe for drinking without needing a whole lot of extra treatment because of the materials that water moves through. Are really good filtration materials. And so groundwater is great for drinking water. It's great for irrigation. It exists pretty much anywhere. If you dig deep enough, if you pump deep enough, you can usually find an aquifer. It should, in theory, be renewable if it's not overpumped, if the groundwater isn't contaminated. And it's cheaper to access than most surface water. Because surface water is always moving, you kind of need to stop it to be able to access it. Groundwater is moving very, very slowly. And so it's almost very easy to access by just drilling down. But the negatives are we are over depleting our aquifers. That's going to result in the sinking of land from overpumping. I'll show you a picture of that in just a moment. Aquifers can become polluted if the percolated material that's moving down through the groundwater brings with it certain pollution components. It brings fertilizers, it brings pesticides. In the case of fracking, you can have fracking liquids get into your nearby aquifers. There's a lot of potential aquifer contamination. And once it's in there, it is really difficult to eliminate from the groundwater resources. And then, like we said, if you have a deeper well, if you have a confined aquifer, that tends to be less or not renewable. And so once it's drawn, it's not going to renew anytime soon, so it's not renewable. The other major issue with aquifers is saltwater intrusion. For those people that live coastally and want to access the fresh groundwater, if you delve deep enough, you actually have infiltration from the seawater. And if you dig deep, there is actually seawater under the ground. And so what can happen is if you tap into that area, if you draw up too much from your groundwater aquifer, the interface between fresh and salt moves towards those wells. And so saltwater intrusion is a really big challenge for a lot of coastal communities that want to rely on well water. When I lived on the East Coast, this was a major issue in Cape Cod, Massachusetts, where essentially the houses are sitting on a glacial moraine that has been there since the end of the Ice Age, and they want to access fresh water that's in the aquifers and should be being replenished. But because of the amount of draw that's going on in those locations, we're seeing saltwater intrusion from the nearby oceans. And basically, once you have salt water enter into your zone of saturation, this well has to be uh, basically capped and not used again because it's been contaminated with salt water. And so that's a major issue associated with coastal aquifer access. In Central California, and here's an example from the San Joaquin Valley, throughout the Green Revolution, the draw of groundwater has exceeded replenishment by fourfold. So we're doing an incredible amount of overpumping of an aquifer that should be being replenished by rainfall, but also by runoff from the Sierra Nevada system. And so what happens when you overpump is the ground actually subsides, and it can cause not only the water table to drop, but the land itself actually begins to subside or sink. This can result in sinkholes forming, and we see this in a lot of locations around the world. In California, the land surface used to be way up here. And over time, many, many years, we've drawn that surface down by taking water out. We also had a fair amount of topsoil removal going on with agriculture here. And then finally, subsidence has resulted in basically, in this case, 9 meters of land subsidence over the course of a number of years. This is going to obviously limit the amount of food that can now continue to be grown in this location, because we'd have to keep going deeper and drilling deeper to get the water that we need. And if your drill isn't deep enough, it's not going to be able to access water and it will run dry. So, it's a big problem, and we're seeing land rebound and land subsidence is associated with aquifer use. The biggest aquifer in the United States, and actually one of the largest in the world, is the Ogallala Aquifer. Great name, really fun to say. It's a shallow water table aquifer surrounded by sand, silt, and clay, and gravel, so it, is able to be replenished from surface precipitation fairly easily. And it's right beneath the Great Plains, so this is an area where we have an incredible amount of rangelands for cattle and other animals, and we have a fair amount of farming and other production going on in terms of agriculture in these areas. It underlies about 170,000 square miles, and it touches on all 8 states you see here in this image, most notably Nebraska. And it's fairly shallow, which means that we can access it without having to drill too deep. And that's great for farmers and other people and ranchers in that area because they don't have to drill very deep in order to get what they need. But 90% of the water pumped here is used for some sort of irrigation. We have seen groundwater level drop 150 feet in some locations. And so if you had a shallow well here, you've been basically forced to abandon it as that water table is sinking lower and lower and lower. We're estimating that overdraw will deplete the Ogallala Aquifer in the next 50 years. And once it's depleted, we don't know where we're going to get water resources for these communities. So we're hopeful that we'll get some recharge. We're hopeful that with more sustainable irrigation practices, we can slow down our draw and allow this aquifer to replenish. But right now, our use of it is unsustainable. In addition to groundwater, we also have surface water. Surface water is any fresh water from precipitation that flows across the land surface and is held within reservoirs. It usually flows via rivers and is held within reservoirs by lakes and wetlands. Most or some of that water is lost to groundwater, and we'll never see it again at the surface level unless we draw it up. And only a third of that runoff is actually available for human use. We refer to that as reliable runoff. And we use a lot of that reliable runoff for irrigation, which is unsurprising, for industry, and for drinking water. We can see in this chart or in this graph or map, we've got a nice comparison of the amount of annual precipitation and overlaid with our supply of drinking water, our supply of reliable runoff. So we have a fair amount of precipitation in the eastern part of the United States, and we don't see that many shortages in the eastern part of the United States, even in areas where we have high metropolitan populations. In the Midwest, in the Great Plains, and into the western states, the pattern, is a little bit more challenging. We don't have as much annual precipitation. We see a shortage, and in some cases an acute shortage of water in these areas. And as you move coastally into the West Coast here in California, we still have a ton of metropolitan locations that we need to support. So our water challenges in the western part of the United States far exceed those in the eastern parts. And in fact, we're starting to see more flooding events in the east and more water shortages and droughts in the west, which leads to wildfires and other issues. So the amount of reliable runoff is not evenly distributed across the United States and certainly not evenly distributed across the world. How do we capture what we have and keep it there and allow it to be a resource? We dam. We have had a significant portion of water dammed basically across the globe. We build these dams to block up rivers, prevent the river flow, create some sort of reservoir behind the dam to capture and store runoff. The largest dam on the planet is the Three Gorges Dam in China. Unfortunately, that it's had a lot of problems. We'll study it more when we look at some case studies. But there's a lot of positives to damming water, but there's a lot of trade-offs. Basically, we have increased the amount of reliable runoff by about a third by damming these reservoirs. And we're holding up to, now it's more like 6 to 10 times more water than the amount of water in rivers around the world, which is great. We have more access to water in places that we didn't. To build these structures requires the displacement of millions of people upriver because we're flooding those locations. So you can see here we've flooded this entire gorge in order to build this reservoir. I believe this is the Glen Canyon Dam. It's going to disrupt the river ecosystem and disrupt the river flow. And what's happening on the top side of the dam is that the reservoir starts to fill up with sediment. Sediment that would normally be flowing downriver begins to build up. And so here we can look at sort of a cross section of a dam and think about what's going on here. So positives, we're now providing reliable runoff access. We can irrigate crops upstream. We can provide drinking water upstream. We can use that reservoir for recreation, for fishing. We can control the flow of the water from the reservoir through the dam to generate hydroelectricity. Downstream flooding events are going to be fewer because we have control over how much water passes through the dam and when that happens. The problem is communities that lived on this part of the river are going to be flooded, and so we can displace people, but we can also displace ecosystems. When you increase the surface area of the water, in other words, you have a reservoir instead of a river, you're going to have larger losses of water through evaporation. If you had farmland or estuaries or cropland or ecosystems downstream, now they're being deprived of the amount of water they used to get, as well as some of the nutrients that they used to get. If a dam fails, and they do, it can be catastrophic downstream, and fish, anadromous fish, and other fish are going to have difficulties moving over a dam, whether they're going up or they're going down. And here we have a nice cross section of the dam. In this case, we have the reservoir on the top side, the intake of water, which spins our turbine and generates electricity, and the power lines that can then bring that electricity somewhere else. One thing that we have to be sort of aware of is that the sediment can build up on the top side of the dam, which can make your reservoir more shallow every year. And so you can dredge the top of the dam to remove that sediment to prevent that from happening, and then you have to dump that sediment somewhere else. But that is sort of one of the downsides. We also do a fair amount of transportation of water, starting, if you think about Western Civ, I'm sure you guys learned about Roman aqueduct systems. And so we've been transporting water for a very long time. Right now we have a massive transport of water across California with the California Water Project and the aqueducts, which essentially takes water from the Sierra Nevada mountains, brings it to the Central Valley, and in some cases brings it all the way to Southern California. In Eastern Europe, the Aral Sea has been subject to a major water transport project as well, and that whole body of water has shrank significantly to the point where there's not that much water left to transport. So these massive transport and massive diversion projects, whether we're talking about a dam or we're talking about an aqueduct system, can be really wasteful. You can see here we have water flowing through, an arid part of California, and it's uncovered. We have a significant amount of evaporation of this water going right back into the atmosphere before it even reaches its resource, or reaches the people that need it. And so that's, one of the downsides to trying to move massive amounts of water from one location to the other. And this has happened in the southwestern United States along the Colorado River, which should be fed by snowmelt from the Rockies. But we have dammed that river so significantly and used that water for a lot of purposes that very little water actually reaches the ocean anymore. And there is an overall decrease in the amount of available water, especially in the lower basin. And some of the most famous dams that you are probably familiar with include the Glen Canyon Dam right here, which basically created the reservoir of Lake Powell, and the Hoover Dam, which essentially created the reservoir of Lake Mead. And these are two massive projects here in the United States that dramatically slowed the flow of the Colorado River, but did increase water access to places upstream from those dams, and also created a fair amount of hydroelectric power generated. And we can see that the flow has dramatically decreased, especially associated with the creation of both the Hoover Dam in 1935 and the Glen Canyon Dam in 1963. And these periods of increase and decrease can also be contributed to climate change as well. We can see that there's a, overall lowering of the flow. Some years are going to be wetter than others, so we may see periods where the flow is higher, depending on what the weather patterns are. But climatically, this region is becoming more and more dry, And when we dam these locations, we are slowing the flow of the Colorado River. The last sort of major water access project that we engage in on this planet is desalination. The removing of the salts from ocean water or a salt lake to get more fresh water. And we can do this through distillation, where we heat a significant amount of salt water until it evaporates, and then we capture that evaporated water as freshwater condensation, and the salts are left behind. Super easy to do, but does require pumping of water and does require a high energy input to actually boil all of that water. We also have this process called reverse osmosis. This is an image of a reverse osmosis plant, which uses pressure to basically force that salt water through a filter. And the membrane, if you think about biological membranes, does the same thing as biological membranes. It prevents ions, so salts, from moving across. And so what's left is the fresh water, and the salts are captured by the membrane. Now, this is going to be forcing water to move against its concentration gradient, and so it also requires an incredible amount of energy to force this water through the membrane material and to trap the salts. We end up with a brine, a wastewater brine, when we've collected those salts, and that has to be dealt with some way by either depositing it on the land surface somewhere or returning it back to the ocean. And so here is sort of the cross sections or the flow charts for reverse osmosis and distillation. And you can see just how intensive these industry projects are, and that there has to be a number of stages of filtration, a number of stages of distillation for either of the processes. And then this idea of the brine discharge, we need to put that contaminated water somewhere, right? We need to return it to the ocean, usually from which we've taken it. And when we do that, we're increasing the salinity in those locations that we're dropping it, which of course makes the desalination process that much more difficult. This project came online very recently in San Diego, which is the Carlsbad Desalination Plant. Really cool project. It's producing about 50 million gallons per day for San Diego County, so it can serve I think it's like 400,000 people. But it cost $1 billion to build this plant. And it's only currently, about to meet 8% of San Diego's projected water demand this year. So it was very expensive. It's a very cool piece of technology. It does what we want it to do, but we're not sure it's serving enough people. But we think it's a good project to have online for future problems that are, where we have water resources that aren't available to us. So there's an intake in the lagoon, and that intake goes to the plant. And once that plant is done with that water, it sends that water right back out to the ocean. Now, if you have a concentrated salt coming out here, what's to say that that body of water won't flow back into the lagoon and come back to the intake? So that's, one downside to this project. The other is it requires an incredible amount of energy. So we built our own power plant to be able to power the desalination project. It also requires a 10-mile pipeline to reach areas where we can actually treat that water. And so we need to transport that water through a pipeline to places where we can do water treatment to make it safe for drinking. So, there's a lot of steps here once you've produced that water to treat it. And we'll talk more about water treatment in our water pollution unit. this is another topic that we've talked about, which you guys are probably really familiar with, the deforestation and the flooding. But I just wanted to bring it back up and remind you that this is a major change in how water flows. When we've cleared an area, when we've removed the vegetation, when we've removed a significant portion of the soil, we're going to have a lot more runoff, and that can result in a lot of flooding. So what are some sustainable solutions? Irrigation methods need to become more sustainable. We've talked about how flood irrigation methods are not all that water conserving. And so we're pushing towards more drip irrigation methods. Again, it's expensive, but it's something that's a little bit better. And trying to move towards more sustainable sprinkler systems on farmlands to improve water usage and to use less water to grow the same amount of crops. So if we can, get these practices going in the Ogallala Aquifer, maybe we can reduce depletion, and we certainly have seen depletion reduced by almost 30% since we started integrating more sustainable irrigation practices. To reduce the threat of flooding, one is to just not build in a floodplain. A lot of the country is built on floodplains, and that is certainly a huge problem. To account for that, we've lined our rivers with levees, with walls to basically hold back water during flooding events. But if those levees are overtaken, they can result in major flooding events. And this is a picture, I think, from Hurricane Katrina, where we saw a significant portion of flooding from both Lake Pontchartrain on one side, but also the Mississippi River on the other side. And we were building in these floodplains, and we have rebuilt in these floodplains, and that's a huge problem. Your textbook also lists a bunch of other awesome solutions. I want you to go ahead and give these a read, both for reducing irrigation water loss, for reducing general water loss in sort of home usage, reducing flood damage, and then, what can we do as individuals to be able to reduce our wastewater. These are really good charts to look at and just read over and have a list in your notebook about things that we can do to reduce our impacts on water resources.